Hello, everyone, and welcome to AP US History for Winners with your teacher, Mr. Johnson. Last time, we talked about the African American Civil Rights Movement from the 1960s, and today we are talking about how the Civil Rights Movement expanded to include other groups. So, if you are ready, let's begin. The first group we are going to talk about is Hispanic Americans, Latina Americans. And we'll start with a little bit of context. As Mexican Americans and other Hispanic Americans are returning home from World War II, they are determined to fight against a couple of issues. One's Jim Crow laws. So, just as African Americans were segregated, Hispanic and Mexican Americans were also segregated. And so they're working to combat that. And they're fighting against poverty to try to gain more economic wealth. And so that's kind of the main issues for them in the beginning. And we're going to kind of go through different decades and some major events that happen in these decades. So in the 1940s, there's a couple of groups that are founded that are important to know of. One of them is the American GI Forum, and that helps bring veterans more rights, Hispanic American, Mexican American veterans. And then there's another one I forgot to put down here. It's called the Community Service Organization, which was founded in Los Angeles. And that is founded by Cesar Chavez, the name you see here. And Cesar Chavez is a very influential labor and civil rights leader for Hispanic Americans, one we should definitely be aware of. There's also a Supreme Court case in the 1940s, Mendez versus Westminster School District in 1947, and that Supreme Court case ended segregation for Mexican Americans in California, so allowed Mexican Americans to go to any school that they wished. And this is similar to how Brown versus Board of Ed ended segregation for anyone based on race in the entire country in 1954, but this one's a little bit previous to that and a little bit more specific. In the 1950s, we see the federal government beginning to deport a number of Mexican American illegal immigrants, which was controversial in some ways about how they carried that out. And then there's a Supreme Court case that we should definitely know the name of. This one's very important, so I would bold and highlight this one, Hernandez versus Texas in 1954. And what this does is it guarantees the 14th Amendment to all Latinos. So we have to think back to the Civil War amendments to remember the 14th Amendment. But the 14th Amendment is an amendment that basically says that no state can make any law which gives people less rights, citizens of Americans less rights. And so now this is guaranteeing that access to Latino and Hispanic Americans. Okay, so continuing on with Latino rights, in the 1960s, we see that, and this is a big general idea, but we see that protests by Latino and Hispanic and Latina Americans are inspired by the African American civil rights movement. So they're looking to see what is working for African Americans, and they're trying to copy similar ideas. Cesar Chavez is pictured here on the left, and he leads a group, which is probably what he's most famous for, called the United Farm Workers, in boycotting work, essentially working on farms, to call for better pay and working conditions for migrant workers. And migrant workers are workers that maybe move in and out of the United States based on work that's available for them, which is a significant issue in their communities. Okay, and there's also something called the Brown Berets and the Chicano movement, which they created some more confrontational protests, and they also led to the growth of studying Chicano studies, Hispanic Latino studies in colleges. Okay, and then in 1965, the last event we'll talk about is the Immigration Law of 1965. Now, I think we've already mentioned this, but it's important, so I'm talking about it again. So bold it, make sure we know it. This abolishes the quota system from the 1920s. And remember, the quota system basically set a number of immigrants that they would allow from certain countries, and it was not equitable. And so now that the quota system's gone, this means that there's going to be more immigration into the United States. And because there's going to be more immigration, more issues, there's going to be more activism along with this as well. Families of legal immigrants living in the U.S. were given preferential treatment. So if you were already a citizen living in the United States, you had people who wanted to, if you had a family member that wanted to move to the U.S., they got preferential treatment. And this especially benefited immigrants from Latin America and Asia. All right, so now we're going to move on to talk about a different group, the American Indian Native American group, and what issues they had with their rights and how they worked to get more rights. So prior to the 1930s, the U.S. is still using the idea of breaking up Native American reservations and pushing for assimilation. In the 1930s, we're going to see some government officials try to integrate more Native Americans into society. So John Collier creates something called the Indian New Deal. Now, John Collier is the commissioner for the Bureau of Indian Affairs in President FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration. And so he's kind of running the government idea about how to try to integrate Native Americans into the United States society. And we see the passage of something called the Indian Reorganization Act, which reversed the 1887 Dawes Act. And so, if you remember, the Dawes Act authorized the president to break up reservations land, which was held by members of the tribe, into smaller allotments, and they tried to parcel out individuals. And so, what this new law does, the Indian Reorganization Act, is that it restores control of the reservations to tribal councils. The government is working to try to preserve Indian cultural traditions. So this is some positives, right? But there are still some issues on these reservations with unemployment, with alcoholism, with crime, and a lack of education on these reservations. In the 1940s, with America's major shift towards World War II, many Native American people did participate and serve in World War II. Probably most famous is this picture here on the left for the Navajo Code Talkers. And that was a group of soldiers who spoke Navajo as a way of speaking in code. And so this way that it was harder to kind of decode American messages in World War II. But they're facing a lot of the same issues. The Native Americans who are living at home are facing a lot of the same issues as they did in the 1930s. Continuing on now to talk about the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. In the 1950s, President Eisenhower is going to push for assimilation. And basically, with the Cold War happening, the U.S. government is going to want to acquire the land that the Native Americans had for their resources. And so the Bureau of Indian Affairs is going to try to push Native Americans to leave reservations and move towards cities, which did not always go well. In the 1960s and 70s, the term Indian is going to stop being used, and more commonly, we're going to see the term being used Native American, which I know is commonly used today, more commonly used today. And President Richard Nixon is going to sign something called the 1971 Alaska Native Claims Act. And what that does is it restores 40 million acres and pays nearly $1 billion to Eskimos, Aleuts, and other Native American groups in Alaska. And then there's the Indian Self-Determination Act of 1974, which restored the legal status of tribes as governing entities so that they can kind of create their own laws on reservations. And then the last group we'll talk about is the American Indian Movement, nicknamed AIM. And the big idea here, and we saw this also with Hispanic Americans, so this is an important idea, is that they are using similar strategies as the African American Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power movement. Okay. Now, the AIM is going to use a little bit more confrontational strategies. And one event they did, they seized Alcatraz Island. They tried to take it back from California. Alcatraz Island is like a prison island off the coast of California. So they tried to seize it at one point and try to take it back. They occupied the offices of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, staged a massive protest there. They also protested at Wounded Knee in South Dakota, which is the site of the massacre of the Sioux in 1890. So some of their protests, again, they're getting inspiration from that Black Power movement, trying to get attention to their cause and trying to get new laws passed in their favor. All right, moving on to Asian American rights. One of the biggest issues in terms of Asian American rights is how America responded to Asian Americans in World War II. And if you remember, with Japanese internment in World War II, America had forced a lot of Japanese people to give up their possessions, their homes, and move to relocation camps. And so a lot of the issues come about when World War II ends and how to basically integrate Japanese and Asian Americans back into society. So California is going to overturn its law called the Alien Land Law. And that law had forbid Asian immigrants from owning land. And so now they're able to own land again. And Japanese Americans sued the U.S. government to try to recover their land that was taken from them in World War II. and they also fought for their right to own the land. And we see a Supreme Court case, Shelley versus Kramer in 1948, which allowed all races to occupy more housing. So it's essentially allowing more housing rights for everybody, but also specifically for Japanese and Asian Americans. The next group we'll talk about is women's rights and feminism. And there's a couple of names that we should be aware of in this one. So Gloria Steinem, an important figure, is going to help create something called the National Women's Political Caucus, which is aimed at getting women more rights in the political realm of the world. And they wanted women to be seen to be more involved in politics. There's also the invention of the birth control pill in the spread of the birth control pill in 1960s, and this is going to lead for more women to demand more rights. This kind of starts what is known as the sexual revolution. There's a trend where we see women are now more in control of whether or not they want to get pregnant. So there's going to be we're going to see an increase in the number of divorces because now children is not going to be a major reason for people to stay together anymore. And the birth control pill, again, is seen as a major growth in the women's rights movement. We're going to see more and more women getting college educations. So education is going to go up. In 1963, there's a presidential commission on the status of women and basically a study, and that documents the discrimination that women are experiencing in this time period in the workplace and in the schools. And Betty Friedan writes a book, Betty Friedan, very important figure. She writes a book called The Feminine Mystique that basically argues that many housewives, especially suburban housewives, were not happy and that they were not fulfilled and that they wanted to start pushing for equality and more access to careers. Now, if you remember in World War II, women had been getting more careers during the war, more factory jobs essentially, and being more equal in terms of the economic sphere of life. But when World War II ended and men came back, there was a big push to take those jobs away from women. Okay. And Betty Friedan's kind of arguing against that in The Feminine Mystique. And then in the mid 1960s to the 1970s, we're going to see some more events here. So in 1963, there is this law called the Equal Pay Act, which established the principle of equal pay for equal work for men. In 1966, a very important organization, we should bold this one, make sure we know it, called NOW, the National Organization of Women. And that's formed to end sex discrimination at work. And that's created by Betty Friedan. Make sure we kind of know the name of that one and who created it. In 1972, Title IX, a very important law, is passed. And essentially what this does is it opened up more colleges for women, okay? It ties federal funds to an agreement to not discriminate on the basis of sex. And this effectively ended legal sex discrimination in schools because schools need that money to fund their schools. And so now schools were not allowed to discriminate based on sex. Then there's this big issue with the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA. And essentially, women wanted a constitutional amendment that guaranteed women the same rights as men in the Constitution, but they would need 2/3 of states to pass it. And it was almost ratified in 1972. They were only a few states away from getting it ratified. And there was a big movement from this woman, and we'll talk about her in future lessons, but a big movement by this woman, Phyllis Schlafly. And she leads a conservative assault to destroy the Equal Rights Amendment. So she argues that women did not need this in the Constitution, that they did not want it, and it was successful. And the Equal Rights Amendment was not passed. There is nothing in the U.S. Constitution that says that women should be equal to men. Still isn't passed today. And then Roe v. Wade was a very important Supreme Court case. It legalized abortion and ensured women the control over their own bodies, which is a major goal of feminism. But recently, Roe v. Wade was revoked, and now it is up to the states to decide their laws in terms of abortion. So there's been some updates with that even through this day. So obviously, abortion is a very controversial topic, and it's not something that that's been settled because they already changed the law on it. Okay. All right, the last group we'll talk about is gay and lesbian rights. And essentially, after World War II, there becomes a growth of a lot of gay neighborhoods. And those are neighborhoods where we see a lot of gay and lesbian people moving into the same neighborhood. And this is going to start to grow into the 60s and 70s gay and lesbian civil rights movements. So there are these reports these books. You can see a picture on the top left, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, and there's another one, Sexual Behavior in the Human Female. And they basically argue that homosexuality was common. It's not an illness. It's not, it was a common thing, okay? It was a common thing. And then there were these homophile movements that began in the 1950s, and they were designed to promote awareness and gain equal rights. They worked hard to appear middle class and to kind of fit in and try to gain more acceptance in mainstream society. But it was not easy. The FBI in the Red Scare in the Cold War targeted homosexuals, and as a result, a lot of gay and lesbian people maintained, quote unquote, being in the closet, meaning they did not come out, they did not tell people of their orientation. A lot of states ended up passing laws that banned same sex practices. And all this kind of leads to the Stonewall riots in 1969. And this is a very important event to know about. So I would bold it, highlight it, make sure we know it. And this is basically an event where gay patrons at a Stonewall, so this place called the Stonewall Inn, are fighting back against oppression in Greenwich Village. And it becomes a national news story. Okay. And essentially, the Stonewall riots births the gay rights movement and pushes it to new heights. Okay, there we see pushes to stop laws from decriminalizing homosexuality, and there was not a lot of progress that was made before 1980, but there were a couple of important things. For example, Harvey Milk became the first gay mayor in San Francisco, and Anita Bryant launched an event called Save Our Children to protest gay rights. And so, why I mention that is so that you can kind of see there is people fighting back, just like with Phyllis Schlafly or Anita Bryant. There's people fighting back against these movements to say this is not the way, gay rights should not be a thing. Okay. So even though there is a broader movement towards getting more gay lesbian rights, not everybody is on board with that. Okay, so that is it for our notes on how the civil rights movement expanded. And I know we just went through a lot of different groups and a lot of different laws and events and people. And so, what I would really make sure you're able to do is for each one of those groups, think about a person, a group, or a law, something that you could use as outside evidence to cite, because these topics could very well come up on the AP test. So, for our big ideas, let's describe the growth of the civil rights movement for Latino, Latina, American Indian, and Asian Americans, describe the growth of civil rights due to lesbian and gay activists, and describe the growth of civil rights due to feminine activists. So, basically, every group commit one piece to memory and commit the overall trend to memory so that you're able to talk about this if it comes up on the AP test. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time.